Hey guys! Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet, somewhere green, somewhere you probably shouldn't go without telling someone first. So, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and imagine the soft rustle of trees outside your window. Because tonight, we're wandering into what people used to call the forest with no end. It's one of those places that shows up on old maps, usually as a smudge of green ink and a vague warning. Sometimes it's labeled something romantic, like the Endless Grove. Sometimes it's just, well, left blank. Which is probably a cartographer's way of saying, I don't know what's in there, and I don't really want to find out. Now, before we start hiking through the metaphysical, let's set the mood. The story goes that the forest sits somewhere between myth and geography, technically located in Eastern Europe, but nobody could ever agree on exactly where. Some said Romania, others swore it was in Poland, and a few insisted it existed in multiple places at once, which, to be fair, would explain a lot. Locals had names for it in every language that touched the region. The Germans called it Der Wald ohne Ende. The Romanians just said Pădurea fără sfârșit and then crossed themselves. Peasants who lived near it told stories of travelers who entered and, well, didn't exactly not come out. They'd reappear sometimes, months later, with strange hair growth and absolutely no sense of what day it was. Which, if you've ever gotten lost in IKEA, you can probably relate to. But tonight, we're not here for the campfire tales. We're here to do what historians do best: wander through a confusing number of unreliable accounts, draw questionable conclusions, and pretend we're being objective. So, let's start in 1832 with the first recorded modern account. A Prussian surveyor named Ernst Wilhelm von Rathenau was hired by the crown to help redraw property lines after one of those territorial disputes that Central Europe was basically built on. He was a very pragmatic man, or so his journals claim, and he took pride in his rationalism. He wasn't the type to believe in fairies, forest spirits, or whatever the peasants were whispering about. Ernst set out with 3 assistants, a horse, and an alarming amount of measuring tape. They entered the forest near a village called Lindenbrook, which you can't find on any map today, because of course you can't. His journal entries for the first day were boringly precise: coordinates, tree species, soil type. But by day 3, things started to unravel. He noted that the moss on the north side of trees appeared on every side, that his compass needle spun lazily as if too tired to decide which way north was. He also wrote, "We found our own campfire, still warm, but we were certain we had left it miles behind." The journal ended there. When another survey team went looking for him months later, they found only his horse, tied to a tree and very unimpressed with the whole affair. Now, normally stories like this would have gone the way of all ghost stories. A few whispers, some poetic exaggerations, and then silence. But no, the Prussian Academy of Sciences got involved because apparently someone thought infinite forest loops were a solvable topographical problem. They sent a team of naturalists led by Dr. Albrecht Kohler, who, according to his letters, was more annoyed than intrigued. His first entry reads, "If I am to walk in circles, I'd rather do it in Berlin, where there's at least coffee." That's the kind of energy we appreciate. The expedition brought along all the latest gadgets of the 1830s, compasses, sextants, and a rather hopeful sense of superiority. For the first 2 days, things went well. They cataloged flora, drew sketches, and even joked that perhaps the forest wasn't endless, just poorly organized. Then by the 3rd day, their maps started to contradict each other. Kohler noted that they could see the sun through the canopy, yet it refused to move, perpetually stuck in a golden, late-afternoon hue. which sounds lovely for a picnic, but slightly concerning for physics. They returned after a week, all present and accounted for, but with some weird consequences. One assistant reported that his pocket watch was 5 hours ahead. Another claimed it was 2 days behind. The Academy dismissed the discrepancies as instrumental faults, because, of course, they did. And for the next 30 years, that's where it stayed. A footnote in obscure journals, the kind that only bored academics and overly caffeinated YouTubers read. Let's float over to another chapter in this slow-motion disaster. The year is 1904, the age of explorers, cameras, and people with far too much confidence. A group of early hikers, the Edwardian kind in wool coats and optimism, decided to trek through the region. Among them was Lady Isabel Fairfax, a British aristocrat with more money than sense and a fondness for collecting experiences. She was one of those people who thought discomfort was character building, which might explain her 17 failed mountain climbs and that one disastrous camel expedition in Egypt. Her diary from the forest is surprisingly calm. She wrote about the cool air, the birdsong, and the endless canopy of green. She described how the forest breathes as if alive, the wind seeming to inhale and exhale, which, to be honest, sounds lovely until you remember that forests don't actually breathe. On the third day, her group became disoriented. Paths looping, landmarks repeating, the sense of déjà vu growing heavy. They tried marking trees, but every mark vanished overnight. One of her entries reads, "We met a man on the path. He wore our colors, but none of us knew him. He smiled as though we should." They turned back, eventually emerging near a completely different village, one that, according to maps, was 70 kilometers from where they'd started. And somehow they'd lost no time. Her watch still read the same hour as when they entered. The Royal Geographical Society published her account under the polite title, "A Peculiar Woodland Phenomenon." They praised her stoic endurance, but quietly implied she perhaps inhaled too much local brandy. Now, we could stop here and say, well, that's just folklore with extra paperwork. But the story didn't die. It mutated. By the 1950s, Cold War paranoia had set in, and governments started taking strange geography seriously. There were rumors of military units vanishing during training exercises, of satellites unable to map the area, of time discrepancies in radio signals. One declassified Soviet memo dated 1957 mentioned Area 9F, anomalous forest grid. The language is bland, bureaucratic, and therefore deeply unsettling. It describes magnetic disturbances, compass failures, and cyclical terrain patterns inconsistent with aerial reconnaissance, which is just a fancy way of saying, our maps are lying to us. The memo ends with a note. Recommend restricting civilian access. Potential temporal distortion risk unconfirmed. You can almost hear the shrug. But as with all things restricted, the myth only grew. Amateur hikers went looking. Some came back confused. Others came back at all the wrong times. There are a few fuzzy black and white photos that supposedly show the forest's folds. Trees bending in impossible angles, like someone twisted the landscape and forgot to untwist it. Of course, skeptics point out that cameras from the 1950s also had a talent for bending reality. So take that as you will. And then, because every story needs one too curious academic, we get Professor Helena Zorich, Yugoslav historian, born 1928, with a PhD in folklore and a reputation for smoking through every lecture. In 1972, she published a paper called Temporal Recursion in European Woodland Myths, half anthropology, half existential crisis. Her theory? That the forest wasn't a place at all. It was an idea that attached itself to geography, a kind of recurring myth reappearing wherever people lost track of time. She called it a psychogeographic echo, which sounds fancy, but basically means the forest exists because people expect it to. She traveled to the area herself that summer, supposedly to observe local traditions. The last anyone heard from her was a postcard sent to a colleague in Belgrade. It read, "The forest is quieter than expected. I think I've been here before." No further correspondence. The authorities searched, found nothing, and, in classic bureaucratic fashion, quietly archived the case. By the late 20th century, the forest with no end had become a kind of cultural shorthand, a metaphor for burnout, urban ennui, or the general feeling of scrolling through social media at 3 a.m.